And Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he'd made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. With these unbelievably poignant and tragic words, our scene today begins with Yahweh's regret. In preparing for this session and reviewing recent scholarship, I was amazed at how many scholars seem to leap right over the characterization of Yahweh here and the amazing view that the authors of this part of Genesis had of the Creator God. Perhaps it's because scholars have been trained to see this as the introduction of the flood story and jump right into the question of sources and the two versions of the flood story, which of course we'll get to very soon. But for whatever reasons, scholars don't seem to spend a lot of time on either this verse, verse 5, and what follows in these verses after, in terms of the characterization of Yahweh and what that says about the conception of the Genesis authors. In this case, call it J or non-P. Non-P suggests that nobody wrote it, so I'm still going to continue to use the older word J, even though we're not sure exactly when that author was. I'm working from the idea that that's from the time of exile, but for our purpose here, it probably doesn't matter that much. All that matters is that we read this in light of the narrative that we've seen from Genesis 1 forward, and how it comes as an utter shock in verse 5 here, and how it plays a part, as you can see on the right side of the screen, in the several stage setup for the flood story that follows. So let's turn to that first, and then we'll look more closely at these verses and the characterization. So the last two videos, we looked at 6:1 to 4. First at the questions raised by that strange and complex set of verses, and then what they might actually mean. And among those things, we saw the blurring of the lines between God and humanity, between the sons of God mating with the daughters of humanity, and the question of immortality and mortality, echoing Genesis 3:22 and the forbidden access to the tree of life here, the limitation of the lifespan, at least from this author, to 120 years, not the immortality that the sons of God might have hoped for. So scholars don't usually see that as part of the flood story. They usually see it as something just separate, inserted in there. As I tried to show last time, I think it's pretty deeply integrated into both what went before, the Toledot of Adam in chapter 5, and what follows, both in what we're seeing today and what follows in what all scholars agree is the flood story, starting with 6:10 and following. But I don't think the issue is so much of exactly when, quote-unquote, the flood story starts, because that's kind of one of those unanswerable questions that scholars can get caught down a deep rabbit hole in. But how, as we have Genesis 6, it sets up several different stages that set up the flood. So as I just noted, we saw stage 1 last time. Now we're going to look at stage 2. Yahweh sees that human thoughts are evil, to Yahweh's deep regret, and will blot them out. And it's scholars who worked at 6:1 to 4 grappled with how does this connect with what we saw, because if there's any fault to be attributed in 6:1 to 4, it's of the sons of God, not of humankind. So there doesn't seem to be a correlation here between what Yahweh sees in verse 5 and Yahweh's response and what we saw in 6:1 to 4. Perhaps not, or perhaps it's simply acknowledging that who the sons of God are humans of some kind or another. Certainly the book of Enoch saw this as part of a continuing understanding of the cause of the flood, including what we'll see next time in 6:11 to 12, where, and I'll show it on the screen here so you can see, a very different explanation. Now, the earth was corrupt or ruined, as a closer perhaps, in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence, and God saw that the earth was ruined, and all flesh had ruined its ways upon the earth. Note that's plainly not using Yahweh, that's using Elohim for God. And so whether it's from a different author or not, it's another stage here. That what we see in the passage we're looking at today, what's happening inside human beings, that their thoughts are evil, is then in the next stage manifest in a ruined earth and violence that fills the earth. And that will culminate in 6:13 with God telling Noah the plan to ruin humans, to use the same word there for ruining humans, and to wipe the slate clean with the flood. So today we're looking at this interim part where we really are just looking inside the mind of Yahweh. And I want to start with that because what a claim it is for the authors of this text to claim that they could look inside the mind of the Creator God and present this soliloquy from inside God's mind. How different that is from a later Christian sense under the influence of Platonism of apathetic God. I was trying to combine both the English way we say apathetic and the Greek way, apatheia, which is to say without passion or without feeling. Central to Plato and to his Christian followers who developed the doctrine that became the Council of Nicaea or the Creed of Nicaea and others later, that was understood as a God who's above and beyond all the earthly machinations and feelings and struggles that humans have, and is simply in the serene zone above that. And without rejecting, of course, the tradition of contemplation in Jewish and Christian traditions, and in fact in virtually all spiritual traditions we know, of a silence and a stilling of the passions, and yet the authors of Genesis here, as the authors of much of the Hebrew Bible, do not portray Yahweh as a platonic, distant, transcendent vehicle of creation, but as one actively engaged in the process. Not just in the hands-on sense that we saw in chapter 7 of scooping up some of the topsoil and breathing life into it, and not just in the sense of hearing God's footsteps in the garden when the man and the woman are hiding, but here in God's internal emotional life. It's easy to dismiss this in our modern world as projecting human things on God and saying we're making God in our image. But certainly the authors of Genesis could not have imagined it that way, that there's a back and forth. Just as we are in the image and likeness of God, as they wrote in chapter 1, now God shares in this regret with humans. And yet, it's obviously a controversial characterization, because in a text that's almost certainly an older text than that, from 1 Samuel, we see this exchange, first from Yahweh and then from Yahweh's agent Samuel. So first in 1 Samuel 15:11, we hear this: I regret that I made Saul king. Using the Hebrew nachem, as you can see, the exact same word we see here in verse 6, translated as sorry. But then just a few verses later, Samuel himself speaks this way: the glory of Israel will not recant or change his mind, using the Hebrew nachem there, for he is not a mortal that he should change his mind, using it again. So Samuel, the character Samuel in the book of 1 Samuel, rejects precisely the characterization that the narrator attributes to Yahweh just 18 verses before Samuel disclaims it, but also what we're hearing here in Genesis. So regardless of whether which of these texts came first, both of them portray a sense of a Yahweh who does regret, who makes mistakes, who sees things turn out not the way they were expected. And in this case especially, the poignancy of it, that we saw in chapter 1, that God looked out on all of creation and said it was good, and looked out on human beings on day 6 and said they were very good. And now Yahweh looks out and sees nothing but wickedness inside the human heart. And in a few verses we'll see that manifest in violence and ruin of the earth. So it's quite a reversal. And important to note here that Genesis, unlike 1 Enoch that we'll look at in a minute, does not attribute the source of this wickedness to anything external. There is no devil, there is no Satan, there are no fallen angels here. It's just something that emerges from the mystery of what human beings are in the image and likeness of God. Unlike Saul, who the text in 1 Samuel says Yahweh sent an evil spirit upon Saul and drove him crazy. Here, there's nothing sent from Yahweh. There's nothing from above except the sons of God we saw last time. There's simply this perception that human beings have become wicked. So let's look a little more closely at the language of that, and then we'll look briefly at how first Enoch interprets what you see on the right side to blend this all together into something that leads to the flood. So Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humankind, wickedness here, ra'at, this is the first of 13 times in Genesis we're seeing this word, but it's very closely related to the word ra, there from 2:9, in the knowledge of good and evil. And you can see this will be a constant theme throughout here. As we saw last time, this is paired with what the sons of God saw, that the the earthly women were good, and now Yahweh looks out and sees the evil of humankind. Note the emphasis also here on the earthly aspect. So the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and Yahweh was sorry he'd made humankind on the earth, and so that will become important as we explore the stage 3 of this preparation for the flood. So the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth. So there is something visible that can be seen there, although it's not described what it is. Perhaps that's simply referring forward to what we'll see in verse 11 and 12, or perhaps not. Nothing specific is named. But this phrase is really astounding. Every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Heart, as many scholars have noted, as we've noted already in earlier videos, represents not the site of emotions, but the site of decision. So, for example, in Exodus, it says that Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, which is to say made Pharaoh resolute, made him stick to his decision. So this is about thoughts, not feelings, and every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts, which is to say the thoughts of their hearts are evil, the inclination of the thoughts of their hearts. So in other words, before they act, they have thoughts, and before they have thoughts, their thoughts are what's leaning toward evil before they even get started. It's not even a fair balance between good and evil from the beginning. It's already leaning that way. The word for inclination, yetzer, is only a couple more times in the Pentateuch, and we'll hear it later in the flood story when Yahweh, and this is a spoiler alert if you're not familiar, recognizes that what happens here is going to be a complete failure. So not only was the production of humans a failure in the sense that Yahweh's regretting that they've turned out so evil and so violent, but the flood itself will be a failure, as we hear in this from 8:21. I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. And so Yahweh recognizes, I've just got to deal with it. I can't change it unless I destroy humanity altogether, in which case there's nothing in my image and likeness in all of creation for me to be in relationship with. I just have to accept that they're leaning away from me. And that's really what we see evil is here. Notice it's not the term sin. Sin isn't mentioned here, but something deeper. And the word for continually here, kal hayom, literally means all the days. So it's not about eternity, it's just to say every day. Every day humans wake up and begin to think evil thoughts. And Yahweh regrets. Nachem here, we looked earlier at how this echoes in a different Hebrew stem. The Nachem, that is the hope of Noah, that he would provide comfort here. Here it forms regret. Notice the regret is not anger. It's not that Yahweh is described as angry at humankind, like a parent who sees a child wreck the car or do something stupid and their first response is anger. Anger almost always an expression that overrides an underlying fear. Of course, the parent's fear is that the child will hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. Yahweh is not angry at humankind here, but internally regretful. And not saying that humans have done something bad particularly, but that Yahweh has done something bad. If not bad, at least flawed. That this making of humankind has been a failure, and Yahweh regrets it. And then it's described in even stronger language. It grieved him to his heart. And the word for grieved here, it's, is closely related to itzavan, which we saw was the key word in the curse, thanks to Carol Meyer's great work on Genesis 3:16, where he saw it's described as toil or labor. It's the pain that women feel in having multiple childbirths and the risk of death in childbirth, and it's the pain that men feel in fighting with the resistant earth for food that brings forth weeds instead of agricultural harvests until human beings return to the dust from which they are taken. So now Yahweh is sharing in the pain of humanity. The pain of women with their multiple childbirths, the pain of men with their fighting with the food, and Yahweh looks out at it and it pains Yahweh to the very core. It's really quite a moment. Whether we take that as a truth about Yahweh or simply a truth about the Genesis authors and their understanding of their ongoing relationship with Yahweh, it's a two-way street. It's not a transcendent God who's just watching. This is not the providence of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Isaac Newton of the deist God, but this is an actively engaged God who's so disappointed that this human experiment has turned out so poorly. And so in verse 7 we see the resolution. So Yahweh says here, and you see the quote from Sarna below, the idea that human sinfulness finds its expression in the state of society and that God holds people in society accountable for their misdeeds is revolutionary in the ancient world, and indeed so. And no other ancient peoples had some sense that their God would have felt bad that human beings had not turned out in a certain way. In the Enuma Elish that runs behind so much of Genesis, we see humans are simply made as an afterthought to do the work that's below the dignity of the gods. So the gods have no direct concern for the humans any more than the king has direct concerns for the slaves who tend the agricultural fields and the canals out in the hot sun. But this Yahweh is concerned. So concerned that he's going to start all over again. And so what we see in verse 7, introducing the flood for sure now, is a promise of an act of uncreation. I will blot out from the earth. Emchek here, it's only used a couple more times in Genesis in the context of this very reality of in the flood. And you note from my note below from David Carr, used elsewhere for erasing names from a record in Exodus, or wiping plates, or even using water to wash a scroll free of a text. And so literally in that sense of blotting out, of using water to remove something from the surface. Here, to wipe human beings from the surface. The human beings that I have created, Yahweh says, using the verb ber here, echoing precisely Genesis 1 and its echo at the beginning of the Toledot of Adam we saw a few videos ago at the beginning of chapter 5. Different than made at the end of the verse here, but created, something, a verb that's unique to God here. Humans can make things, but only God creates things in this language. And not only the human beings, but together with animals and creeping things and the birds of the air. And it's not clear why that is, but it's specifically reversing the sixth day of creation, as you can see in the note from chapter 1, verse 24, of what it is that's wrong with the animals and creeping things, which generally refers just to things on the ground like reptiles and insects and such, and the birds. Well, the birds won't all be wiped out, of course, because there's going to be a raven and a dove that Noah gets to bring back the olive branch at the end. And certainly the fish don't seem to be hurt by this, and the things of the sea are not said to be blotted out here. But the surface is going to be just wiped clean and start over. And as many scholars have said, there seems to be in the words here of both the description of the ubiquity of human inclination toward evil in verse 5 and God's resolution to blot it out here, that there's no escape hatch. There's no exceptions. There's nothing like in Genesis 19 where Abraham convinces Yahweh, if there are 10 righteous people, not to destroy everybody in Sodom. There's no separating the innocent from the guilty. Everything is going to be wiped out. It's as if the creator in the laboratory or the painter in the studio has just wiped the slate clean and said, this can't be fixed, I'm just going to try again. And as we know, and as I've already hinted from the echo from 8:21, it's going to be a failure. So the human experiment disappoints God, and this attempt to start over again will not succeed. So we see the portrayal of a God here who's experimenting, who's apparently never had a creation before, never had a creature in the divine image before, and is trying to work things out. Whether you find that terrifying or comforting may depend upon your state of internal being, of how satisfied you are with your own life, but I'd suggest it allows for a lot of empathy and a lot of mercy. And one of the things we'll see when we look at the flood story, and certainly compare the Darren Aronofsky movie of Noah, where Darren Aronofsky, the filmmaker, notes that he was horrified and haunted by the Noah story and the flood story from the time of youth. And one of his purposes in the film was to see if the character Noah would recognize the need for mercy. That if Yahweh can't recognize the need for mercy, there has to be some need for mercy, even if if divine justice requires that humans face some consequences. So we'll be continuing with that later. And then finally, this ends with the repetition, verse 7, I'm sorry I've made them, forming a nice little chiasm between verse 6 and 7, with the sorry made them framing it, and the decision to blot people out at the center of that. And yet there is a little hint of hope at the end for Noah, but Noah found favor in the sight of Yahweh. It's not but in the Hebrew, it's simply and, so it's not presenting this as an exception or something apart from, but it's a continuation with it. So at the same time that Yahweh is grieved and pained and resolving to blot out humanity and all land creatures, at the same time Noah finds favor and provides just a sliver of hope that this human divine experiment can continue. That's where we'll pick it up next time. See you then. Bye.